I'm Liam Billingham.
I'm George Fragopoulos.
And I'm Joyce Wu.
Whoa! There was a little delay there, so it was like really exciting.
I wasn't sure if you were going to introduce me.
So dramatic.
Like it's proper etiquette for you to introduce. But you know what? In a way, I feel welcomed into your family because I was already a part of it. You know?
No, it was amazing.
Okay, thank you.
This is Oeuvre Busters, and that was the longest introduction we've ever done. Yay!
But it was also the most dramatic.
Hi.
I know, it's bad. I don't put it on enough.
I wear sunscreen every day.
My wife does too. She's
Same.
like, I'm not leaving the house without it on my face. George, you wear sunscreen every day?
It's in my moisturizer. I use a very, very elaborate moisturizer.
You're very
prim
that's
and
really
proper.
Responsible. I am one of those guys that's like, I don't need it. And then my feet catch on fire.
And
the reason we're
20
talking
years
about...
later, you're going to have cancerous moles removed
Well,
from
and that's
it,
the thing.
so.
Every time, it's funny you bring that up because every time I go to the doctor, they're like, "Well, Liam, we got to remove 4 things right now." So
I like the idea of you
I should...
just slathering copious amounts of sunscreen though on your feet, like just like drenching your feet.
They're like white. Like I look like Joaquin Phoenix and Joker on my feet. It's just like
Exactly.
white. The reason we're talking about the heat is because we're continuing our discussion of Akira Kurosawa and Toshiro Mifune. And George, what movie are we talking about?
We are discussing 1949's Stray Dog, a classic.
Or
film
Nora
noir.
Inu is the Japanese title
Yep.
from 1949. And who better to talk to about it than our friend Joyce Wu? Joyce, how are you doing?
I am doing really well. I had no idea. I always respected him as an actor, but I never realized that Mifune is like a stone cold fox.
Oh yeah,
That's why we're doing this season. We
he's a
haven't
hottie.
really talked about it
I
enough.
mean, I think because of like the characters that I'd never seen Stray Dog before. And
cool.
So for me to see, I was like, holy shit, this man has no bad angles. That is a face that like you just, and it's a horny movie.
Yeah.
It is a horny movie, and he's a beautiful human being. Like when
shockingly beautiful.
When I was getting when he turned 100 or would have turned 100 this year, and so the day of his birthday, there were all these pictures online, and I just found myself going through from beginning to end and being
Swooning.
like, my God, that was one thing. But the second thing is that if you look him up and you look at him like not on set, he's one of the most astonishingly well-dressed men I've ever seen too.
Yeah.
He can really dress.
It's kind of like that Paul Newman where someone is so beautiful, but they're also so fucking cool in their outside life
Yeah.
that you're just like, oh, it's not fair. How is anyone
I
like
know.
that?
He was so cool.
So cool.
Well, we're glad you're here. We should read your bio. George, I'll read the bio, okay? I'll take the bio on. Does that sound good? George?
Go for it.
George isn't allowed to speak for the rest of the podcast.
Well, you were gonna do the plot summary. That's how we do it.
Okay.
Well, it's just funny because
wanna make it fair.
the notes also say like read by Leah, but like read the bio. Go for it.
Joyce Wu is a writer and director based in Los Angeles. She was an inaugural member of the Made in New York Writers Room, a fellowship developed by the Writers Guild of America East in partnership with the New York City Mayor's Office of Media and Entertainment, where she developed and wrote a half-hour comedy pilot based on her web series, Mr. Right. Her first feature film, She Lights Up Well, is currently available on iTunes. Welcome to the show.
Thank
Joyce.
you
Officially.
so much. Thank you for
This is
having
great.
me. I can
This is
now
so exciting.
feel okay. I feel good now.
Okay,
Now that I'm
we all know who Joyce is. It's happened. So you'd never seen Stray Dog before.
Never
Were you
seen
like a
it.
Kurosawa Mifune fan, or?
I think I've seen. It's like I'm one of those posers who knows the hits. Like, you know what I
Sure.
mean? So I hadn't done too deep a dive, and for me it was crazy to look at his filmography and realize that a year later he made Rashomon and another movie. Like that's what's crazy. Like how do you make how prolific he was is insane. Completely
Especially
insane.
because this is his second directorial movie. Second That's how you say it when you go to Spago, you guys. You say Move. It's his second movie with Mifune, but it's his 9th feature film. It's a Mifune.
Sorry. It's a second. I love a portmanteau. You must know this about me. And so, but
it's in your bio. I just didn't read the part where it says Joyce loves a portmanteau.
So this is his second collaboration with him.
Yes, and I think it's in terms of directorial. Yeah, it's the second movie he's directed, and then he wrote one called Snow Trail, and then but it's his 9th film as a feature film director.
It's crazy. And
he is at this point 1910, I think he was born.
How old is
he? He's 40.
Oh God.
Yeah,
and
he was born in
1910.
So he's 39. So he directed. This is his second movie of the year because what's it called? Quiet Duel came out like 3 months before this.
Oh God, that just makes you feel why do we even bother?
I know, it's unbelievable.
Why do we get out of bed in the morning?
It's like, I've made 60 something episodes of a podcast, so I think it's comparable. George, do you want to read the plot summary for Stray Dog?
I would love to read the plot summary.
You.
For Stray Dog. So Stray Dog tells the story of rookie homicide detective Murakami, a young idealistic officer who has his gun stolen off of him on a crowded bus. So the film is basically the story of Murakami trying to track down his stolen weapon, a Colt. The search becomes increasingly desperate as the gun is used in a series of crimes and eventually is used even in a murder. Murakami teams up with an older, more cynical police officer by the name of Sato. The two track down the weapon to a petty criminal by the name of Yusa. Sato is wounded by Yusa in a confrontation in a hotel with the gun. Eventually, Murakami, with the help of Yusa's sister, tracks him down to its train station where he's attempting to flee. And there's a confrontation between the two. Murakami is wounded by his own weapon, but he eventually is able to arrest Yusa and get his gun back. And there's a final scene in the hospital where we find out that Sato, in fact, will survive. And him and Murakami have this kind of like final moment together in the hospital room where they come to some sort of potential like understanding, maybe, or Murakami comes to a sort of kind of potential understanding about the cruel nature of the world. The end.
Boom. The end?
The end.
Question mark? This was directed by Akira Kurosawa. It was his 9th feature film. It was written by Akira Kurosawa and Ryozu Fukushima. It was produced by Sojiro Motoki, who had produced most of his films. Production companies, this is interesting, were Shin Toho, which was the branch off of the original Toho studio after strikes in 1947, and Film Art Association, which we talked about in our last episode, which was kind of like a studio put together, or a production company put together by by Kurosawa and some producers that he worked with. This is interesting. It's based on a book he wrote.
Whoa.
He wrote the book of this before he made the movie, and he found it really difficult to translate it to the screen. And one final thing that I thought was interesting is that long, maybe arguably too long sequence when Mifune is walking around Tokyo looking for gun sellers. Most of it's not Mifune. It's the assistant director and a single camera person doing those shots.
What's funny is I had an edible before I watched.
Nice.
And that part, which I think if I hadn't, would have maybe felt long, but it was like mind blowing to me. Like all of those sort of crossfades with his eyes and these things that were happening. Like it was so beautiful. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking a lot about, sorry if I'm just jumping right into it.
No, it's fine.
No, go for it.
But for me, I realized that some parts of it felt like they lagged I realized that my attention span in quarantine is just not what it used to be.
Oh, yeah.
And I think especially with features where there's a whole new world, you're getting introduced to it. And I think as Americans, our cinematic diet is we rest on genre sort of playing out in a particular way. And it's funny because I paused when they were on the roof. And is that that almost could have been like a little short in and of itself, right?
Oh yeah.
And we're like 18 minutes into the film, and at this point, this guy's just been looking for his gun. That's it, And so it can feel kind of narratively unsatisfying through a lot of it. And I realized the more I watched, the more the film progressed, the more brilliant I thought it all was, because in an American style cop movie, the goal is very clear. The sense of urgency is there. And this wasn't as tightly structured, but it felt more like actual cop work, because there are misdirections and a lot of it is just sort of,
No, totally. I think it's interesting you bring that up, because I love this film. I found the rewatch of it this time a little tricky. I think just because similarly in quarantine, concentration is a different ballgame. But it almost is like episodic in its structure, which I don't think I noticed the first time I saw it. Like the loss of the gun is really interesting. The pickpocket, like following Ojin, the pickpocketer, for a big chunk of the film. And then sort of the longer extended search, and then the ball game, and then the kind of like build to the ending is like, and like, man, Kurosawa loves baseball. Like, that's the big takeaway from that sequence. This guy loves baseball, because we're watching a lot of people do the same play over and over and over again.
Do you know if he just sort of documentary style, or was that like footage that already existed? Did they just set up at a game that was already going on?
I think they just shot at a game. I think they shot at a game and then shot like the scene in the near the exit, like obviously at a later date. But it feels pretty it feels like they set up a couple of cameras. It's interesting. I've been reading a couple different texts, and there's, at least in the two that I have dug into, and I know there's more, there's like scant information on production of this beyond knowing that that they shot a lot of the Tokyo stuff, like sort of fly on the wall documentary style, which is really different from how he'd done anything up to this point as a filmmaker.
And I think it's amazing, because no major studio movie in America would ever be shot that way.
Yeah, for sure. Especially
it's just
then.
Too risky. Yeah, back then. I think now, like maybe some movies in the 70s that were doing that kind of verite thing,
Right.
But it's crazy. It's crazy how I read that he found the film too technically proficient and less, like he wasn't as pleased with it.
Yeah, that's what I read too.
And for me, it really combined the two, because you can take a still of literally every single frame in that movie, and it's a piece of art. It's beautiful. It's every single shot in that movie is beautiful. Like just the way the frames are, it's incredible.
George.
Oh, I love this film. But I too also, I saw it maybe like 6 weeks ago or 2 months ago for the first time.
Oh, that's right. You watched it recently.
I watched it recently. So
before we planned this.
Yeah, so it was good to go back and rewatch it, and some of the things just kind of stuck out in a way that they didn't the first time. But yeah, that sequence, to just return to it a little bit, where he's walking and walking and walking.
And walking.
It's an amazing kind of, it has like this kind of documentary feel. It has like these amazing shots of obviously kind of like life in the city. You get a real sense of kind of the environment that he's traveling within. But weirdly enough, also reminded me, obviously in a different part of the film, but it reminded me of like the first, 12 or 15 minutes of There Will Be Blood, where there's no dialogue whatsoever. And you're just experiencing this guy like doing his thing. And so much is conveyed in just him, again, like hitting the street, walking around, looking at people. Like, it's an amazing, and again, it doesn't go a little bit too long, but I mean, obviously I think it's supposed to like represent like his isolation and his alienation and his kind of like sense of loss. So like it works.
I don't know. He
really,
seems
really
pretty
well.
happy to me. He seems like pret's chill dude.
He's fucking
really
thrilled.
calm.
Yeah.
He's just like,
I look like Toshiro Mifune. What do I have to complain about? I'm fucking hot. I'm the shit.
Well, what's interesting to me is that we don't really get his voiceover until the very end, because at the very beginning it's like some other narrator, right? Or something weird.
It's like a what do you call it? Like an omniscient.
Yeah. And that feels, I guess, novelistic in the way that the chapter are kind of feeling. But at the end, when he's, sorry to skip ahead, but what I thought was interesting is that you finally see that maybe he is a good detective, because when he's on his own, he's like, okay, it rained last night. He probably has muddy shoes. Look around. He's like, he get to hear his process, and you see that he actually is pretty competent, because he spends most of the movie being led around by more competent, experienced detectives. Like, he's not good at his job. He loses his gun. He chases this total dead end. He only, all the avenues that he explores are ones that other people have suggested to him. And he gets described as a greenhorn in the beginning,
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting that, and then at the end you see that, he actually has because that long sequence of him wandering around, it's like, this is a terrible thing. What is your plan here? Like, because you don't get to see, you don't have any insight into his process. Is it literally you just put on these, dirty clothes and you're going to wander around? What do you hope to find?
It is kind of amazing how now, having seen a few of these in a row, that every Kurosawa movie, including the ones that don't star Mifune, play with the young, inexperienced sort of what's the word, like newbie versus the like old, experienced, wizened kind of figure, right? Like, and I took the exact same note. I don't think he's, good cop, but in the sense that, like, is he good at his job of being an investigator? No, he's terrible, especially at the beginning of this movie.
Yeah.
But it's not about
and it's an
detective
amazing
work, right?
What?
It's not just about detective work.
No, but he just doesn't. He has no chill, and I think it's I think it's interesting because he's constantly surrounded by these like very chilled out older dudes. Like I think it's Abe, the first one, who he tells he lost his gun to. Murakami keeps calling him sir, and at one point he's like, "Please stop calling me sir. You don't have to call me sir." Like, it's an interesting. I don't know. What really stuck out to me, at least, is that he's such a he's so caught up in his mistakes that he kind of can't see past it. And I don't know what you guys think. I feel like that's kind of what the movie is about, is him coming to terms with, like, he's going to screw up a little bit.
Well, yeah, I think part of it must be cultural, in that I think that there is a feeling of personal responsibility that I think in Eastern cultures, look, I don't know that much about Japanese culture, but I grew up in an Asian household, and I think there's this idea of personal responsibility and responsibility to your community that Americans or people or Europeans are less concerned about. And I think he's upset, even, and everyone else thinks it's an obsession that he should get over, but it's the idea that it was his gun that haunts him. And it's interesting because I started to get really like psychoanalytical about it. Like, well, the gun is like his masculinity. It's like this phallic thing that's like being, and I would be interested to talk to you guys about, I guess, that in a lot of ways, Yusa is like his shadow self. Like, they talk a lot about in the film about how he also got his knapsack stolen, that he also survived the war. And at the end, Yusa's white linen suit is so soiled by the like rolling around on the ground, and the two of them just in the grass. It's like they're two flip sides of the same coin.
That's a really interesting point too, because we didn't talk about it in our Drunken Angel episode either, but there is that amazing, the final scene is Mifune's characters rolling around.
Son of a bitch, you stole what I was going to talk about. Nice, keep going.
You gotta be quicker than that, Liam. Where he rolls around in the white paint.
Yeah.
And then like his suit obviously like turns white, and
at the end of Drunken Angel, he gets into a fight with another, like an older mob enforcer, right?
Yeah.
Like an older guy. He's a young Yakuza. This guy's an old Yakuza, and they get into a fight outside an apartment and get covered in white paint.
And that's why I think like the Angel, like, not to like again fucking talk about Drunken Angel too much, but that's why I think I was a little resistant. Like when we talked to Stuart, he was like definitely like, oh no, it's the doctor who's the drunken angel. But like, well, the film also like at least visually suggests that Mifune's character might also be the angelic figure, because he does make also like the ultimate sacrifice of giving up his life to send that guy back to jail. But anyway,
I think what's interesting about the previously on Oeuvre Busters, I think what's interesting about the shadow self idea is that I think you know, again, like one of the things that's tricky with these films is talking about them and trying to understand what, obviously really difficult to understand what's going on culturally in Japan in 1949. But obviously there's this post-war, they talk about après-guerre kind of feeling. There's a westernization, and I think that this movie plays with like what's Western. And I know that Kurosawa's movies were often criticized for being, quote, like too Western by the censor board, and it was only like more experienced senior directors that could get his films through. But that shadow self thing is really interesting because in terms of what it has to say about all of his relationships, because I feel like the relationship between him and Yusa is mirrored in his relationship with Sato, who's played by, I didn't do the cast list, but is played by Takashi Shimura, who's plays his father in Quiet Duel and all these movies. Do you guys feel like there's kind of a parallelism between all the male relationships in this movie and how, at least to me, Murakami's in the middle, and like on one side is Yusa, who's like this, you know, kind of is portrayed as like a fuck up, but also potentially like a long-term career criminal, like going forward. And like the cops who are all sort of like really cynical assholes. Like it really bothers, like especially in the present context, I'm like, ugh, these guys are the worst.
Oh yeah, as you know, and it's interesting to watch a cop movie in this time now that we're having these discussions about cops, and I'd be interested to know what you guys think. I guess about the end where. Is it like a forget it, Jake, it's Chinatown kind of moment where we're meant to be left with like, that's fucked up? Because what we love about Mifune's character is that he does care and he's empathetic. Like he has compassion for Yusa because he thinks about so many men came back from the war and what did he say? They act like beasts. And, you know, and no one else is providing that context.
Yeah, no, I think that's my reading of the film. That the reading that I have of it is that it ends in a really, really dark note because, again, this kind of sense of, let's say, responsibility, the sense of communal belonging that this guy has that makes him, let's say, a decent, and I'm putting this in quotation marks, like a decent cop, is lost, right? The lesson that it seems like and obviously it's not explicitly told in this way or delivered in this way, but that the lesson that he has to learn is that he has to turn into this like cynical asshole if he wants to in fact like do his job
and survive.
So I was like, damn, like this film is fucking like dark, and I'm not saying it represents necessarily like Kurosawa's worldview, but watching it again I was reminded of like, oh, like it doesn't end on a good note.
No, well, and it's interesting because it was interesting to see Sato's family life because there is something to be admired in the way his children were so polite and sweet and his wife was so kind. And there was this idea that you can have this your relationship to your family and how you live your life that way is a virtue of some kind in and of itself, right?
Totally, yeah.
Well, and it also has this edge of like, there's something immediately recognizable across the board culturally to a figure like Sato, because when we first meet him in the movie and he's interrogating the gun mole played by Noriko Sengoku, who's like so good in every Kurosawa movie she's in. And, you know, when Sato interviews, one of the things that's really great about the film is Murakami's whole style of policing is like leaning in and being really intense and thinking there's like a performative quality to being a cop. Whereas Sato's thing is like, I'm going to sit here and eat a popsicle and I'm going to talk to you and like, we're just going to have like a chat. Yeah. It's like a good cop, bad cop kind of routine. Yeah. And you can see that like clearly he's like made this decision that like all criminals are bad, people are bad, and I have my family, and I'm going to go home, and I'm going to invite this guy over randomly, and, like, we're going to eat squash. And it's all very charming until he's like, oh, but also, like, you have to be a bastard to do this job. Yeah. And you're like...
And all those people are animals, like, literally.
Yeah, he basically calls all these people animal, and that's where the après-guerre kind of thing comes up, right? Where he talks about how, like... I wonder also if the gun, in addition to representing... this kind of like masculinely Freudian thing also has to deal with like guilt around Japan's behavior in World War II and like feeling this like weird pressure. There was a quote in the book where, in Mifune's autobiography, where an American woman saw the film and called the Association for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. And basically like complained that they hurt the dog. And he has this quote where he was like, I was so angry about that I wish we had won the war.
What?
And it's this like interesting thing to think about. Yeah. I was thinking about that when I read the book because I was like, when I was watching the movie, because like Murakami has come back from this war. He's lost his gun. He feels this like immense guilt. Some of it, I think you can look at it in terms of a cultural guilt. And there's this cop who's like, nah, man, they're all bastards. Come to my house. Come see my children. Come look at this beautiful life I had, because like my life wasn't derailed in the same way because I'm an older man. It's a really interesting. And so does he want that? What does he want from his life? And I don't think the movie gives him any guidance about who he is.
No, he doesn't know what he wants. It's interesting because when we first meet him, I mean, the film is every frame, as we talked about, is so beautiful. But when he's at the gun range, just how cool that he looked in that suit with a Panama hat.
Yeah.
And it's like, in a way, he seems so at ease with himself.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because as the film goes on, you're like, all the things about the rice rationing cards and like we forget or I'm not always conscious of post-war Japan and how economically depressed it was, and how, and it's weird that as the film goes on, we get more and more about how actually maybe he wasn't doing that well, and maybe people weren't doing,
Yeah.
Because even Sato is like, I live in a glorified shack.
Right.
And and I would say in that moment he showed compassion for Yusa, because he's like, well, I didn't live in that fucking like whatever Yusa was living in.
Yeah.
That hovel.
Yeah.
But
well,
Liam,
that part's really depressing too, in terms of just like looking at the way. It's a really interesting statement on post-war Japan that I don't know if it gets enough credit for being necessarily. I don't know.
Although Liam, the reading you just proposed though is interesting, because like, so if we
Thank you, George.
if we say
I try. Thank you.
If we say that, so the psychoanalytic reading is obviously the one that like he gets his like dick back, and
nice.
He gets it back in relationship. I mean, we also haven't discussed like if it is, the psychoanalytic reading is also applicable in the relationship with the father figure of Sato. So it's this kind of sense of like killing the father or becoming the father to become like fully your own person. I guess what I'm trying to say is like if we maybe acknowledge that the getting the gun back is a certain kind of coming into wholeness, then how does that play into this, I guess, kind of allegorical reading of it, which I'm not saying is wrong, but I'm curious about like, so what does that do for that reading of like, oh, this film is about, let's say, Japan's guilt in being in the war. So does the getting the gun back in some sort of way mean like accepting that responsibility, the accepting of the violence that has been done to others? I mean, I'm just kind of curious if you like thought about it in that sense.
I think it's complicated because it's already been done. So at this point, it's like, and someone else, I forget who says it, where one of the other cops is like, if it weren't your Colt, it would have been some other gun. Mm-hmm. And so it's this sort of idea that the deed has been done. People do horrific things to each other. Forget it, Jake, it's Chinatown. It's kind of do you know what I mean? There is this feeling that even though he's gotten it back, terrible people's lives have still already been ruined.
Yeah.
There's, to speak to that point, and it's really interesting to think about Chinatown because I love thinking about Chinatown. But the idea of this thing being part of the like rich detective film noir, like I feel like all film noirs are almost always like a little bit about guilt and that kind of the sort of like heritage of that, especially like with American film noir films, like kind of being all about life after the war in America. But there's a kind of, at least to me, at the end of the film, I feel like Murakami has accepted something that he did not accept before, which is maybe it's that like actions have consequences. Which seems obvious, but it works in a really profound way in this movie, because as much as some of the themes of the movie feel, let's say, like contemporary, like they feel obvious in terms of like the heat, in terms of like, I think the point about like them being in the same suits, the shadow nature of it, like things that feel like we've seen in movies since, but are like really astute. There's a kind of subtlety to the idea that at the end of the film, he might be a wholer person, but kind of maybe what he swallowed is poison. Because all of these men, Abe, Nakajima, who's the guy who helps him find Ojin, the pickpocket, in the first sequence of the movie, they spend the whole movie being like, dude, this is not your fault. Like, you didn't kill these people. you lost your gun. He didn't have to use. It's like an interesting question of like who's ultimately responsible. And I think they would argue that like, hey man, shit happens. If you're going to be a cop, you got to accept the fact that shit happens. And he spends the whole film being like, is this my fault? Did I do this? Yeah. Well, that's the question. I don't know.
Maybe that's a generational thing, that the young were willing to face the consequences of what they were asked to do. Mm-hmm. And the old are just sort of like, okay, well, that's just how it is, you know? And maybe there's more of a tension in Murakami because he doesn't, especially coming from a society that is so hierarchical and about respecting your elders, and you know what I mean? That he could have an independent thought and feel like maybe this is not something he wants to participate in. One more thought. I think he does come into his own because in a way, like from what I understand, the pedagogical kind of traditionally in Japan is about, you know, if you want to be a ramen maker, you've got to spend 6 years being an apprentice to someone who makes ramen, and you sit there and you're not allowed to do anything. And you just have to like eat shit for 6 years while you slowly, you know, learn this craft. And there are really beautiful parts of that. But then part of it's like, we have a movie where the protagonist spends like the entire middle of the movie basically saying nothing and just being kind of following around this other guy who's doing all the work. And it's not until he's forced to be on his own that he comes into his own, that he starts to use his own brain and his own powers of deduction to actually make a good call.
I think that that's interesting to think about when you mentioned that he doesn't say anything in the middle of the movie, because that's obvious. I mean, that's like Mifune, in addition to being looking good from every angle, is also an incredible physical actor. But not only is he an incredible physical actor, and the framing in this movie with the sort of like crop style of shooting for the, I don't know what the aspect ratio is, and the fact that the movie is entirely composed of threes. So you'll see someone in the foreground, someone in the midground, background. There's a lot of that. But this movie kind of introduces, I feel like, what you see later on in Mifune, in some of the hits and some of the regular films, which is the Mifune grunt. Like the ability to kind of answer things with a sound or with a movement or with a gesture. And it becomes more like authoritative, more, let's say, he becomes more of an authority in other parts in the films. But the kind of like, to speak to his guilt, his inability to kind of like articulate and to just be led around and kind of like acknowledge things with a grunt or push back is like so central to this character. It's like these things are happening to him. He's not making them happen until kind of towards the end when he confronts the girl and his mother. And then, as you pointed out, when he's doing actual detective work in the train waiting room.
Yeah, maybe this is me with my own shit about trying to individuate from my family or my culture or whatever. But I do think that there is something very subversive in a traditional culture that is telling you that because you're younger and less experienced, that you have nothing to say or contribute. That like actually maybe he is a good detective and we didn't realize because and maybe you know that's what's hard about a watch as an American contemporary audience is that he is quite passive in a lot of ways. Right? For most of the film.
Absolutely. And also, I guess it's worth noting that his like sort of father figure has been shot. So it's up to him now.
Yeah. With his own weapon, right?
Become the detective, right? Like in a certain sense. That's really, really interesting because he kind of has to come into his own at the end of the movie. So do you guys think at the end of the movie, it's hard to say, but I don't know if he's quite evolved into the figure that Sato wants him to be. I still think there's empathy in the guy. I don't know what you guys think, but I don't think he's like a total, he's like totally gone down the route of becoming a cynical cop.
Well, it's left open-ended for sure.
Yeah. There's something in the performance and the ending that feels like he's like, okay, I'm not living off every word you say anymore.
Yeah. Even the way it's staged, like he's looking out the window,
He's looking out the window, yeah.
And I would say, I thought the movie was going to end when the two of them were both just in the grass. There's a great two-shot.
Yes.
Where you see that, and it's like the mirror kind of image of each other. And for me, what that is telling me looking at that image is that he's not so different from this guy. And he could have easily have become that guy. And that guy could have easily, if one thing had been different, that, you know, that they're not so different. And having that understanding is, I think, paramount to how you treat detective work or police work, right? instead of saying, oh, these people are just animals and they're terrible and that's just how it is. And you slowly just have to stop caring to say that I could easily have been that person.
Yeah, definitely. I also think that like we're also talking about guys who, especially Kurosawa is 10 years older than Mifune. So Mifune is, oh my God, he's like 29, 30 in this movie. Mm-hmm. But Akira Kurosawa is like right in that middle period, like in his age where he could go the way of the older guy. He could go the way of the younger guy. And there's a certain sense that like, I feel like, you know, when you read about him and his there's a lot going on in Toho in the 40s and 50s in terms of strikes and like workers' rights and things like that. And he was always kind of in the middle of, I feel like when you read about him, he's like, I really want my friends to work, but also like it kind of came back to like, I just want to get back to work and make things and do stuff. And I think you can see that a little bit reflected in the Murakami character, where I think he just kind of wants to just keep going. And everyone around him is like, stop.
Yeah.
Stop. Calm down.
I mean, we wouldn't have the first 2/3 of the movie if he were just like, well, I guess I just have to go home since I've been put on administrative leave.
Yeah,
you know,
totally.
like in a way, it's like, it's so pointless. I'm like, what do you even think you're doing? But he feels like he has to do something.
It's futile, and like there's a bit of an existential kind of like angst to his character. Maybe that's something that we've sort of addressed. But he's very like angsty. I feel like I watched this movie and I'm like, this guy is full of angst.
Yeah. Well, that's why to me it's also like, again, watching this again, I think the theme for me in all of these films is going to be like, oh, Kurosawa is a very spiritual director. And I think like obviously what he does in this film as well, like, yes, it's clear, it works on all these levels that we talked about, like the psychoanalytic, the film noir levels, but there is also this kind of, again, where he's so good at taking these like mundane details and making them part of the story and giving them these kind of like much larger, if you want to call them existential kind of significance. So like the heat wave, for example, isn't just like obviously like, oh shit, it's really fucking hot. But it takes on this kind of like existential dread and this existential kind of power that, I mean, at least for me, like kind of is meant to symbolize something about like, again, like his alienation in the world, about like the cruelty of like this environment that they find themselves in. It's just another kind of layer of like existential ennui, let's say. That's
and
right.
It brings the movie on ennui. It brings one thing where, you know, the like we're sort of talking around is that this is a genre movie, and like to me it's the best kind of genre movie because it has at its core it's like a crime film, which is really great, but really it's about these like larger issues of culture and culture clash and old and young and like kind of giving up versus like believing in something better. Like it kind of embraces all these themes, and it uses things like the heat and the gun mole and all these bits to like keep you rooted and to keep you kind of excited about what you're watching. Well, like it still is like a crackerjack of a police movie.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, and I would say on a craft level, obviously, you know, it's so beautifully shot and composed, but like his ability, that's what's crazy about Kurosawa is like, he can direct the shit out of anything, right?
Anything.
And you're like,
baseball.
Yeah. And there's that scene in the ballistics lab where he's comparing the bullets and that close up where he's like turning it and you see, and it was like, there was so much tension and we felt it. And like, even, you know, when you see the footsteps, it's like he could do what Hitchcock did in his own way. And it's like, that is a man who spent his entire life working on a particular kind of genre and crafting that. Yeah. And Kurosawa was like, yeah, I can do that shit. Sure.
Yeah. This is my ninth movie.
Does it. Yeah. And that's what's incredible is that, you know, while it may be kind of languid or slow in some parts, you're like, holy shit, scene to scene, when there needs to be tension, you fucking feel the tension.
Yeah.
So like, it's less narratively satisfying in some ways because of the slower parts, but scene to scene, when there needs to be dramatic tension, he's a master.
Yeah, you lean in during this movie. You're like, what? Like, oh my God, they're looking at something through a magnifying glass. What is it? Yeah, no, it's really amazing.
You actually feel it.
He also has that ability to, like, you don't really know what the guy is doing when he's looking at the bullets under the microscope, but his visual language is so strong that you understand what it is.
Yes.
That you're looking, like, you know when you know, but you don't know what it is, and I think that that's really cinematic. Like, you watch a movie and you're like, what the hell is that? But you don't really know what it is. I think a lot when I watch Kurosawa, like films like this one and High and Low, which is probably my favorite Kurosawa movie, they always remind me of David Fincher movies, or that David Fincher has seen these before, because like there's like a hypnotic
procedural
focus.
kind of quality, yeah.
Procedural, but the procedural says something much larger than just being a procedural about like the culture. High and Low is like the masterpiece of this. It's a great kidnap film that all of a sudden becomes this like incredibly powerful, I think, commentary on like post-war Japan. Like that's really, really worth seeing.
Yeah, that's the where you're dealing with a real master, where it's like it is narratively satisfying, and the craft, like what you're watching is so well made, and it's still saying all these things that, it's not empty. It's not shallow.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's so, and like I love a good like crackerjack kind of thriller, but I think I was a little bit overwhelmed by how much emotion is in this movie, especially at the end. I kept thinking about like I thought a lot about the ending of Heat, which seems ridiculous, but the way they of course I did, the way they chase, there's like a moment where he's chasing him into the woods that reminds me very much of the chase into the airport and into LAX at the end of Heat, and the kind of parallelism, like these two guys are the same person, they have the same lives, but they're on opposite sides of like a societal law. And also the other movie, I didn't think of this, but I think I was reading it somewhere, I thought a little bit about The Bicycle Thief.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Which I just didn't even make that connection. Yeah, a year later, and this is a year later, and they're both kind of existential detective dramas about a missing thing.
Right, but I would say what's interesting is that The Bicycle Thief, the sense of urgency is built into the narrative because he has to get that bike if he's going to go to his job. And the interesting thing about this movie is that the sense of like it starts to ramp up towards the middle, where you realize, okay, this guy is on a spree. Who knows what else is going to happen? But for the first half of the movie, he's in no rush to do anything.
Right.
There's no sense of urgency at all.
That's really true. And they're both kind of like, yeah, that is a really interesting point, because you spend the whole time in Bicycle Thieves being like, the whole time. It's kind of amazing.
Yeah.
And I just think that the use of the missing object, and like it also has a little bit of the Chekhov's gun in it, where it's like a gun introduced in the first act is gonna, it's like the best example of that.
Yeah. And but what's amazing also in Stray Dog is that how many bullets are left. And like that's what's so fucking cool at the end of that chase scene, when you're like, okay, like you're counting the bullets because you know exactly how many are in the chamber, and that's another way where the tension, you're like, holy shit, he's got two more. What's gonna happen? It's like
it's really incredible. Interesting. I was just thinking when we were that there's the bullets, which I think the gun starts with 7, and by the time he sees them, there's 3 left. But it's interesting how, and it just occurred to me, there's Mifune's character Murakami, and then there's 3 men to whom he closely relates, meaning Sato, Sato, Abe, and Nakajima. And then there's actually kind of in a weird, I feel like this has to be intentional because I think Kurosawa worked this way. There's 3 women.
Oh yeah,
there's
that makes sense.
Ojin the pickpocket. There's Noriko Sengoku as the gun mole. And then there is Kiko Awaji as Harumi.
Well, what about Sato's
mother.
wife and the mother?
Sato's wife. Yeah. So I guess it's 5. Damn it. But the idea of one of the things that I love about this movie is that it's so when I think of it, I think of that relationship between Sato and Murakami. But watching it this time, I was like, oh, the way he relates to these women is really interesting. My favorite scene in the whole movie is at like the 17-minute mark when Ojin, after he's followed her all day like a creep, comes outside with like a beer and some food and is like, eat, shut up, and look at the stars.
Yeah.
And that's like the second,
such a human.
Yeah, and that's like
it's a human moment.
Yeah, that's like the first of like. So there's that other scene also later on where it's with Sato, and you get like that shot behind them of the clouds and of the sky. And again, it's like this gesture towards these like much larger, I like, again, like to me, these like much larger, like potentially like metaphysical or like spiritual kind of questions or dynamics that are at play. But that's a beautiful moment. Yeah. Where she's just like, just look at the stars and just kind of like enjoy the moment for what it is. It's a very, It's a beautiful scene.
Stop being a cop.
It's so beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah.
Defund the police.
And exactly. She's like, ACAB, have a beer.
Yeah. Here's a beer.
Defund the police. Drink beer. Buy beer. Defund police.
But what's crazy is that you would never see that in an American film because it would be like, the studio would be like, what's the point of this?
Yeah.
Yep.
Cut this out. Who cares? And it's like, there's so much value in seeing, if it is a procedural, to see the process, but also for him to have that lesson. I mean, because Kurosawa is asking the biggest, deepest questions you can possibly ask always. Yeah, I'd be curious to know what you like, the horniness of the film.
Yes. Can we go back to this? Because you mentioned it about a half hour ago. I was like, wait, horny? Not horny just because Mifune's hot, but just like horny because...
So hot. So hot.
Everybody wants to bone.
Beautiful man. But it's interesting because I can't, again, maybe this is because I had a gummy, so my perspective is different. But there's that scene where where they're in the interrogation room eating the popsicle.
Oh yeah.
And it just goes on it's gratuitous. She's right in the foreground, just fucking sucking this popsicle down. And then she takes out a cigarette and starts puffing the cigarette for like a minute.
She smokes
straight.
that cigarette. So that's interesting because she smokes that cigarette like someone who's never smoked a cigarette before and has a pre-existing nicotine addiction. Like, woof. But also the way people eat in this movie.
Oh my God, yeah. But
they don't eat, they like absorb it into their mouths.
Just the way her mouth, like, it was so crazy. And then with the chorus girls, I mean, we've got like 40 seconds of just looking at sweaty chorus girls.
That's right.
Just lying there. And I wonder if it's part of it's like Kurosawa saying, okay, you want film noir, I'll give you a sexy dame.
Here it is.
Here's a, and as a woman, I'm always looking at the female characters. And for me, like, Sato's wife is like, okay, she's perfect. She's sweet. She's a good mother. She's so one-dimensional. And all the women kind of are. And it's interesting because I wonder to what extent he's aware of how if it's just like, these are tropes and I'm going to use them so I can tell my story. Or if he's just like, yeah, whatever. He didn't, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I was thinking about that a lot, actually, in comparison to the parallels between Yusa and Murakami when you talk about the stuff with Harumi, when at the end of the movie where she's like, the mom's like, he stole that dress for you. And she's like, yeah, like, that's what you have to do. Like, if that feels to me like the most developed kind of character in the movie is the one who's like, yeah, this guy's like a jerk and I don't like him, but like, this cop sucks. And like, I would rather have these things in my life. That's the only, and I feel like a little bit with the pickpocket at the beginning, like they're super one-dimensional, they're pretty one-dimensional, but to me, at least with that final one, I feel like he does something interesting theme-wise about like the young generation being like, these values that you have are bullshit. I want nice things in my life.
Right. Well, and it was interesting also for me, again, as an outsider to the culture and watching this in 2020 is, for a long time, it felt low stakes to me because it's like we have spent more than half the movie and he's just looking for a gun. And then like, boy, this woman is like flipping out because she has a stolen dress. And I realized how cynical we are as Americans. We're like, okay, like, what's the big deal? Because the stakes feel so low compared to what the fuck we've seen in life and in films, right? Right. And in a way, but it is getting to the heart of like, there is something very shameful about taking what is not yours if you believe in a society. Like now, it's like contemporary Japan is very little crime. People are very law abiding. Like I jaywalked when I was in Japan and people looked at me like I was an axe murderer. You know, and it's like there is something like, and I would just be interested to talk to someone who's Japanese about like when, you know, how society has changed from when this movie was made to now. Yeah. And it was just like, it's just a dress, who cares? But then on the other hand, it's like your responsibility to your community, to society, whether or not you want to be a good person or you're just out for yourself.
I think that's a big key to what the movie is about too, is the idea of like, does it matter if, okay, so you lost your gun. Is it your fault that these killings happened? And I think that like, you know, it's great because both sides are argued with equal power in the movie. Like on the one hand, you're like, it's not, there are these cops who like have been in it a long time and get it. who are like, it's not really your fault. And I think it's fair to feel that way. It's also fair, at least in my mind, to be like, yeah, but like you did like the one thing. Also, why was your gun in your pocket? Why does he grab?
You don't keep your gun in your pocket?
I'm just gonna put my gun in a linen. You keep your gun. Yeah, I don't wear that many linen suits, but it almost simultaneously like makes me go, I'd be annoyed at him, but also I feel sympathy for the guy because he's young and
he doesn't know any better. Yeah.
And I think that's what it is that in a way, a lot of the inciting incident is something, again, is very passive. It's just something that happened to him. And he wasn't particularly careless. If there was a pickpocket, you know what I mean? Like, yeah, it was interesting. How much responsibility, I guess how much responsibility do you have to accept for the things that happen to you? And I think it can't be truer than for people who were soldiers in a war. Like that is something that you are mandated to do, that you're forced to do. And how much responsibility as individuals do you bear for the atrocities that you committed?
Mm-hmm.
Another thing that I've always found interesting, and I don't know, I mean, I think obviously this plays into his performance, but Mifune is like arguably, at least like to American audiences, like maybe one of the most famous Japanese men that has ever lived. And he wasn't born in Japan. He was born in China. And he didn't go to Japan. And I think he was like there's this great story about how he would train these guys who were like in the military, who were flying off to like almost uncertain death. Mm-hmm. And he would tell them, don't say goodbye to the emperor, say goodbye to your mother.
Whoa.
And just this idea
That's so
of
subversive.
like playing this guy, especially at that time, playing this guy who's like a soldier who's, you know, gone off and fought and kind of gets screwed on his way back. And as a person, the sort of like his real life being like, I don't even really necessarily, I mean, from what I understand, like he wasn't that attached to Japanese nationalism. He didn't like really go out of his way to proclaim, to be like a proud Japanese. Right. Is just really interesting.
Well, it's interesting if we think about American films that are made sort of like Vietnam movies about people who struggle with their experiences there. It's and I think that's a big cultural, even if like your allegiance to your country is always questioned when you're subjected to something like that. Mm-hmm. But it's interesting because I feel like the American story would be much more about his individual pain, whereas Murakami is obsessed with how his behaviors affected his community and society. Like he's obsessed with like not hurting other people.
Yeah.
It's really kind of, I don't know, I've been thinking about this a lot. As we're seeing more and more sort of like, let's say, people embracing this idea of like defund, abolish, remove kind of things, is the like pushback in the United States from like cop unions and organizations that are playing the, you know, I feel like read as like they're playing into their victimhood a lot, and it's like really hard to swallow that when you're like, you're literally cops, like there's you're like it's like this is ridiculous. And it's interesting to think about how so much of American film around this stuff, as you pointed out, is about the individual. Whereas, I never thought about that before, because this movie is really about how he affects other people. And that's his concern.
Yes. And it's something that has struck me a lot in this time, because in a way, having grown up in, straddling, two cultures, growing up with, an Asian household, but in America, it's like the thing I struggle with lately is that, in countries like Taiwan, where my parents are from, there's like no virus anymore because people wore their fucking masks and they did what they were supposed to do. And in a way, I can find parts of that culture so suffocating, because your responsibility to your family or to your country or to your community is so oppressive, and you're not allowed to individuate in any kind of way. And I think Americans are obsessed with their individualism and their own rights and their own, don't tell me what to do. and in a way, there's something beautiful about being able to celebrate your idiosyncrasies and to have your own thoughts and not conform. But what we end up with is like what we're dealing with, that we have
Right.
a disgusting outbreak and tens of thousands of people are dying because they can't think about their community.
Yeah.
And we've normalized a certain type of victimhood, which is like the victimhood of people that should know better and can do better. Like that's the thing that I think is weird,
that's
is
right.
that it feels like just going around my neighborhood here and seeing people without masks on who are much less likely to be affected by this thing economically.
That's right.
Fun times. Some light talk here on Oeuvre Busters.
One thing I want to chat about quickly before we wrap up, because
Yeah.
you made the point about the women being sort of one-dimensional in this film. The one moment that I think really is interesting in terms of what Kurosawa his relationship to the women in the movie is the scene after that sort of extended dance scene, which is like literally just like a flesh carnival. Like you're watching these women dance.
Which is the original title actually for the film, by the way, was Flesh Carnival.
Flesh Carnival. That's the original name for this podcast. Flesh Carnival. Flesh. But then there's a sequence where they all go back and they all collapse.
Yeah.
And he just lingers on that. And I found it like weirdly
Erotic.
You almost never see in movies the women.
Yeah.
You never see it's always like them as objects of desires, not like, oh, I'm exhausted by the fact that I just had to dance
Showing
for a
that
bunch of
they're
horny
labor.
22-year-old boys.
Well, they too are being exploited, right? Like, I think there is something about the system where people are so poor and they're really strong. Yeah, that is interesting. Because for me, I just saw the cinematic exploitation of like just seeing these just the lingering, and I loved them. Listen, I'm not against like a horny film. Like they were beautiful shots, but there was something about that's the thing. It's like, are you making a comment on it, or are you just luxuriating and seeing a lot of sweaty, young, naked women, sort of just lying there? I don't. It's interesting.
There's a story in one of the books about the actress that played Harumi, Kiko Owaji, was like 16.
What?
Yeah, she was young. She was really young, and she wanted to be a dancer. And apparently, because she'd never been in a movie before, she was like difficult. I mean, she was 16. She was 16. Yeah. So like they complained about how she like wouldn't do what they wanted and da 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 da. But there's also these like, and I mean, in the book it reads as harmless, but when you think about it, there's also this bit she's like, but I also used to like hang out with Mifune and Kurosawa, and we would like smoke cigarettes, and you're just like listening to that, and like the book doesn't say anything, but the like the subtext to it is like,
yeah, it's problematic.
It's really it reads as really problematic. So he's obviously not immune to the maleness of being a filmmaker.
No. Do we think Christian Bale based his Batman voice on Mifune's voice?
Oh my God.
I never
What a connection to our previous season.
Bringing it back. Let's just say yes, he did. Of course.
I think he did, because they're like, who sounds like that? Do you know what I mean? Like, that's not something. And apparently, I read somewhere that Kurosawa, the only thing he did not like about Mifune was his gruff voice.
Oh.
He's so beautiful, and then that like voice comes out of him.
Yeah, it's like, what is that? But
it works really well though when he plays like later on, like in Rashomon.
It works well in
for
everything.
example.
I think it works all the time.
Yeah. But in Rashomon in particular, like when he inhabits that kind of like, and also like Yojimbo and Sanjuro.
Seven Samurai.
Yeah.
Right.
Redbeard.
Yeah.
Let's just list all the movies.
It matches with the aesthetics of how we perceive him, because he's supposed to be kind of gruff. In this, like, he's so barefaced and beautiful and clean cut. Yeah.
It is interesting because I saw this and I saw High and Low around the same time. And if I remember correctly, that would have been like right around when The Dark Knight came out, and then, or soon thereafter, probably a little bit before. I got into these ones like in the 2000s. And then I remember seeing Inception and being like, man, Christopher Nolan has to be a Kurosawa fan, because all the men, at least the crime films, because they're all in suits and they're all kind of repressed and they're all kind of just like good looking, and that like, well, at least in the Nolan movies, in that like bland white dude way where you're like, they're all very serious and they're all very professional and they take their jobs really seriously. I feel like there definitely is like a little influence, but I'd never thought about the Batman voice.
I feel like it has to be there, but maybe that's just me.
No, I can see
It's
that.
a very interesting connection, yeah.
One last question. We seem to do this at the end of every episode.
Yeah.
Who's the stray dog?
Ooh.
Who's the titular stray dog?
So many options here.
George is...
Yeah, George.
It's the dog at the beginning.
Yeah, it's a dog at the beginning, of course. You see it in the credits.
It's obvious.
Well, what's funny about the dog is that there's something menacing and really goofy about that dog.
It's very dog.
Like,
it's very
tongues
goofy.
hanging out. And I think that's that dichotomy is really interesting because I think, to me, they're both like he's looking for the stray dog that is Yusef, but he's a stray dog too.
Yeah.
And then they talk about mad dogs, right? Like where you go after you're a stray dog and you become like a beast.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's both of them.
Yeah.
Right? It's got to be Yusa and Murakami. Great movie.
It's about the duality of man. It's an amazing fucking movie.
It is incredible. It's really like, yeah. I mean, the older I get, the longer I do this as a filmmaker, the more I get I hate those people. To me, when people are like, meh, mediocre, not, it's like, no, this is a great movie and he's a great director for a reason because he actually knows what he's doing.
He really does. It's like you feel in the hands of someone who's entirely in control of like the craft of filmmaking.
That's incredible. It's really inspiring.
Joyce, this has been really, really amazing.
Yeah, thank you, Joyce.
Do you have anything you're working on you want to tell us about?
Well, so I'm working on a bunch of things that that won't come out anytime soon, but I'm trying to get my movie. It'll be on Amazon Prime and maybe some other streaming things soon. So please.
Very cool. This is the She Lights Up Well. Mm-hmm. Cool. Awesome. All right, great. Well, we will, once that comes out, we'll share it with the world. Yeah, thank you for coming on. This has been great. We would love to have you back on in the future.
Oh, that's such
if you would like to do that.
Really, it's funny because I had some nervousness where I was like, last night I was afraid that I wasn't well prepared enough for this discussion. So I appreciate. Thank you so much for having me.
You could always just pop a gummy before you record with us too.
I think I need to do that. It's the duality of my Asian overachieving needing to be very well prepared. And
I just think it's a little nuts that your entire room is just filled with big pieces of paper with notes on it. Like, it's insane. Look at just a stray dog question. Who is the stray dog is written in chalk on like a blackboard.
My whiteboard is just filled with,
No, definitely. Please come back. This is great. It was so much fun. Next up, we're going to talk about Scandal, George, which I've never seen.
The Kerry Washington show? Love it. We're gonna go through all seven or 8 seasons. It's a weird departure in the middle of our Kurosawa.
If this is suddenly like going like we're now talking about the oeuvre of Shonda Rhimes.
Liam makes all the calls here, so I mean,
I make the decisions. And next up, we're talking about
Grey's Anatomy.
I make the decisions. Yeah. Grey's Anatomy. All 33 seasons.
Yay! All right, I was Liam Billingham.
I still am George Frigopoulos.
And I remain Joyce Wu.
And this... Oh, wait, review and subscribe to the show. And this was...
Oeuvre Busters.